Hi everybody, this is Lindsay from windingroadcrochet.com, and today I'm going to show you how to make the toddler puff stitch dress. This dress comes in 3 sizes, 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months, and you can find the full pattern for it on my blog, or you can buy the printable PDF on Etsy. So here is just a quick overlook of the pattern. We're going to be working this top section first, and then we are going to chain out to make the full length of the dress, and then from there we're just going to work our way down and add a trim. So this is a relatively easy dress, but it does have a few little tricky areas. Now I use the Karen Pantone Bamboo yarn. This is a beautiful yarn, and I thought it was a really fun way to get lots of colors without having to buy a ton of different yarns and having lots left over. For the 12-month size, I did use 2 skeins, but for the 18-month or the 24-month, you will definitely need 3 skeins of yarn. And really quick, I'm just going to show you how I pull this apart. You just clip the string at the end, you pull all these little loops of yarn apart, and then you're definitely going to want to wind them into balls to make them much easier to use. Do not try to use them from the skeins they're in right now. You will end up in tangles. I did because I tried to do that with my first dress. For this pattern, I am using a size H crochet hook, but you will want to use the size that gets you the correct gauge, which can be found in the written pattern. And we're just going to go ahead and get started. I'm starting with the lightest color. I'm kind of sticking to the way the colors were when they were in the skein. And to start this pattern, we are just going to make a slip knot, and for the size 12, which I'm showing you here, we are going to chain 18, and we're starting with the top of the dress. If you enjoy this tutorial, make sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for more crochet goodness. So once we have our 18, the next thing we will do is single crochet into the second chain from the hook and in every chain across. And then I am going to be working in the back bumps just because we're not crocheting around this at a later time, so I want this top seam to look really nice and clean. Doing it this way does take longer, but I always do find that it is worth the time. So if we finish up row 1, we just have a row of 17 single crochet, and now we're ready to do row 2, where we're going to be making that eyelet pattern at the top of our dress. So you'll chain 2 and turn. We do not count our chain 2 as a stitch, so we're going to double crochet into the first stitch, and to increase we're just going to chain 1 and then double crochet into the next stitch. Now along the rest of the dress, you're going to chain 1, skip a stitch, so skip the next stitch, and then double crochet into the following stitch. And that's going to give us that pretty open stitch work at the top of the dress. So chain 1 again, skip the next stitch, and work a double crochet into the following stitch, and do that all the way across until we reach the very last stitch of this row. So when you reach the very last stitch, you will chain 1 again and then double crochet into your last stitch, and that will act as an increase here. And that will complete our row 2, and we'll have a nice pretty eyelet stitch here. So for row 3, we're going to chain 2 again. Again, remember that does not count as a stitch. We're going to work a double crochet into every double crochet and every chain space along this row. So work a double crochet into the first stitch, a double crochet into the chain space, and then simply repeat that all the way across the row. So you have a nice solid row of double crochet. So we'll finish row 3, Move right on to row 4. In row 4 we'll chain 2. And then we're going to increase in the first stitch and in the last stitch, and then just double crochet in every stitch across. So we're going to work 2 double crochet into the very first stitch, 1 and 2, and then just start double crocheting in every stitch across until you reach the very last stitch. So when you reach your very last stitch, you're going to work another 2 double crochet into that very last stitch. And that completes row 4. So as we move on to row 5, you're going to chain 2. And in this row, we're just going to double crochet into every stitch across. So no increases, no decreases, just double crochet in every stitch across. And just work a stitch into the very last stitch of the previous row, and now we're ready for row 6. So we're creating a really gentle slant on the bodice of this dress. So we will chain 2. And just like row 4, we're going to work 2 double crochet into the first stitch, a double crochet into every stitch across, and then 2 double crochet into your very last stitch. So we're working our first double crochet into the first stitch, and then a second double crochet into the first stitch to make an increase. And now we'll just double crochet in every stitch across until we reach the very last stitch. So once you reach the very last stitch, you are going to work 2 double crochet into your last stitch. And that is the end of our row 6, and we'll move right on to row 7. And then in row 7, we are going to do exactly the same thing we did in row 6. We're going to increase in the first stitch, double crochet in every stitch across, and increase in the last stitch. So we'll reach our very last stitch. We'll work 2 double crochet into this last stitch to finish up row 7. And there we have our first 7 rows. And at this point, we are actually going to fasten off because we're going to start again and create the waistline of our dress. So just pull that yarn tail through the very last loop to fasten off. Grab your yarn, make a new slip knot, and then we are going to start row 8 by chaining, work across row 7, and then chain again. So put this on our hook, and we will chain 24 for the size 12 month. So once we've chained 24, you're going to pick up your bodice so far. We're going to work into that very first stitch, and we're going to work 2 double crochet into the first stitch here. So this is what they would call a standing double crochet. Just hold your chain still and you'll be able to complete a double crochet without having to slip stitch and chain up on this row. So we've done 1 double crochet. We're going to do a second double crochet into that very first stitch. This is just mimicking that nice angle we've created with our bodice. And then now we're going to work a double crochet in every stitch across until we reach the very last stitch. So once you reach our very last stitch, we're going to work another 2 double crochet into the very last stitch of row 7. Alright, and then now we are going to chain 26. And that's going to give us the other waistline of our dress. So here we have completed 26 chain, and you can kind of see how we've made a much wider waist for our dress. So moving right on to row 9, we are going to double crochet into the 3rd chain from the hook. And once again, I'm going to work into those back bumps so that it has a nice clean edge to it. But you're going to double crochet into every chain, double crochet into every stitch, and then double crochet into every chain for a total of 76 double crochets. So when we reach the end of row 9, we'll move right on to row 10, which is going to be another very easy row. You can see we still have an open waist. We'll join it in just a few rows. So for row 10, you're just going to chain 2 and turn, and then work a double crochet into every stitch all the way across the row. So another 76 double crochet. Finishing up row 10, and at the end of row 10 I'm going to go ahead and change my colors, because in this next row, row 11, we are going to go ahead and start making our skirt and making the puff stitches. So just chain your color and then chain 2 and turn your work. So we're going to clip our other yarn thread and turn our work, and for row 11 we're going to start with a double crochet into the first 7 stitches. Once you complete all 7 double crochet into the next stitch, we are going to work a puff stitch. To make a puff stitch, you're going to yarn over, insert your hook into the next stitch, and pull up a loop. Now do that 4 more times. Yarn over, insert your hook into the stitch, pull up a loop for number 2, yarn over, into the stitch, pull up a loop for number 3, yarn over, into the stitch, pull up a loop for number 4, and then do number 5. And with that last yarn over, we are going to pull that loop through all the loops on the hook. That is your puff stitch. And then now we are going to chain 1, and this is what I'm referring to as our closing chain, because that closes up the top of the puff stitch, but it does create 2 stitches at the top of the row. Chain 1, and then working into the same stitch, you're going to work another puff stitch. So you yarn over and pull up a loop 5 times, and then yarn over, and that last yarn over you're going to pull through all the loops to create your puff stitch, and then chain 1 to make a closing chain. And that is going to cause some increases in this row, so we start getting a pretty A-line skirt. And then next you're going to double crochet into the next 11 stitches and then create another puff stitch combo in the following stitch. And we're going to repeat that a total of 5 times to where you have 6 total puff stitch combinations. So I'm working my 11 double crochet. Feel free to stop the video to catch up as I do this a little faster, and then work that V-stitch with the puff V-stitch is basically what we're doing. So work your puff stitch, your closing chain, your chain 1, and then another puff stitch. And those closing chains and the tops of the puff stitch are going to be really important when we get to the next few rows. So finish up our puff stitch, finish up our closing chain, and then just repeat the 11 double crochet and the puff stitches another 4 times. you'll have a total of 6 puff stitch areas. Once you've completed your last set of puff stitches, we are just going to double crochet into the very last 8 stitches. So now we are working on row 12, and this is one of our kind of row repeats that we're going to reach in the skirt. We're going to have a repeat where we are keeping the same number of stitches all the way around, and then we're going to have a repeat where we are increasing. So to start this row, we are going to double crochet into the first 8 stitches. And every one of these stitches that we're double crocheting into is going to actually be one of the double crochet stitches. So here's our 8th double crochet, and now we are going to skip this puff stitch and that closing chain, and we are going to do a puff stitch, chain 1, puff stitch in just to that chain space in the center. So go ahead and do that. But it is important for this row, we are not increasing at all, so we need to both skip the puff stitch as well as that closing chain. It would be really tempting to go ahead and work into the closing chain, but it is not a double crochet, it is the closing chain. So we're going to chain 1, work another puff stitch, closing chain, and then on the other side you want to make sure you skip the top of the puff stitch and this closing chain and work into the next double crochet. And just like the last row, we're going to work 11 double crochet in between our puff stitches. And then once you reach your next puff stitch, you're going to do the exact same thing, skipping the puff stitch and the closing chain and working into the space in between the 2 puff stitches. And you're going to do that all the way till you reach that very last puff stitch with 11 double crochet in between each sets of puff stitches. So once we get to that last puff stitch set, we are just going to double crochet into the last 7 double crochet stitches. And that completes that row. Now moving right on to row 13, this is going to be the row where we are increasing. And so we are going to work a double crochet into the first 7 stitches. So once you reach your puff stitch, we're going to be working a double crochet into the very top of that puff stitch. And then just like your previous rows, we'll work our puff V-stitch into the chain space. Make your first puff stitch. Finish it off with a closing chain. Chain 1, make another puff stitch, finish it with a closing chain, and then we're going to work a double crochet not into the puff stitch but actually into that closing chain behind the puff stitch. And that will give us 2 increases. And then you'll just work 11 double crochet in between those 2 puff stitches. And simply repeat the same thing, working a double crochet into the top of the puff stitch, your V-stitch puff stitch in the chain 1 space, and then another double crochet into the closing chain on the other side of the puff stitches. And you'll repeat that all the way across the row. After your last puff stitch, you'll just work a double crochet into the closing chain and then a double crochet into the last 8 stitches to finish up this row. And here you can see that in row 13 we had increased, and then in row 12 is where we skipped those stitches. So we're going to have a nice gradual increase on the skirt of this dress. In row 14 we are going to chain 1 and turn. And it's going to be similar to row 12 and how we do the puff stitches, but we are going to create a button flap in row 14, and we're going to do that by slip stitching to the first 2 stitches. So we slip stitch to the first 2 stitches, and then we are going to chain 2 and work a double crochet into the first 7 stitches. So make sure you work a double crochet into the next stitch and all the way until you reach your puff stitch. And then just like row 12, we are going to skip over the puff stitch and the closing chain of this row. This is a row where we're keeping our stitch counts the same for the most part. And we'll repeat that all the way across the row. So you're going to work your puff V-stitch right into that chain space, skipping over the puff stitch. Closing chain, chain 1, work another puff stitch. Closing chain. We're going to skip over the puff stitch, skip over the closing chain, work a double crochet into every double crochet across until you reach your next puff stitch, and then just repeat this all the way across until you reach that very last puff V-stitch. Once you reach that last puff stitch, you are going to skip the puff stitch and the closing chain and work a double crochet into the next 6 double crochets. But you're going to leave the very last 2 double crochet unworked. These are going to act as our flaps for our buttons, and then you're just going to push your buttons through the stitches for your buttonholes. But then we're also going to slip stitch to the very first double crochet made in this row, and that is going to join our dress. From now on, we will be joining at the end of every row, so we have a nice continuous dress. So from here we're going to move right on to row 15, and in row 15 you're going to chain 2. And again, this is going to be kind of a 2-row repeat, though your stitch count is going to change. It's good to have the pattern to keep track of your stitch count. But for this row, since it is going to be an increase row, because we just did a row where we didn't increase our stitches at all, we skipped over our puff stitches. Now in this row we're going to increase by working into the top of the puff stitch as well as the top of that turning chain. So for row 15 we are going to double crochet into the first 6 stitches, and then again, because this is an increase row, we are going to work under the top of that puff stitch after our 6 double crochet. So we're working into the top of the puff stitch. We're going to work our puff V-stitch into that chain 1 space in between our puff stitches. Chain 1 in between your puff stitches. And then we're going to work another double crochet into that closing chain of the previous row. And then you'll just double crochet across and repeat that every time you hit a puff stitch. After you double crochet into the last closing chain, you will double crochet into the last 7 stitches, and then just slip stitch to the first double crochet. And you will continue repeating these even rows and these increase rows until you have the total number of rows you need for the skirt for the size that you are working. For 12 months, you will continue repeating these increase rows and even rows until you reach a total of 25 rows. And then we will work on our trim. So here I have completed all the first 25 rows, and I just changed colors wherever I ran out of yarn, but also only at the very beginning of a row, so you don't have any color changes in the middle of the row. I'm just going to slip stitch to my first stitch of this row, and I am going to use a different yarn color just so you can see what I'm doing on these last few trim rows. So we're just going to change colors here. So we're going to start the trim by chaining 1, and then I am turning my work, and I am going to single crochet into the first stitch, and we're starting a kind of a 6-stitch repeat here. So then chain 1, skip the next stitch, and single crochet into the following stitch, and then you're going to chain 3 and skip the next 3 stitches, and that's the end of your repeat. So to start the repeat over, after skipping those 3 stitches, you're going to single crochet into the next stitch, chain 1 again, skip a stitch and single crochet into the following stitch, then chain 3, and then once you reach your puff stitches, remember that the puff stitch, the chain, closing chain, and both count as separate stitches. So I'm going to single crochet in the stitch before the closing chain, skip the top of the puff stitch, chain 1, skip the top of the puff stitch, and then work a single crochet into the closing chain. And then you're going to chain 3, and when we skip the next 3 stitches, we're going to be skipping the chain 1, the puff stitch, and the closing chain, and then working our next single crochet into the very first double crochet. And the important thing here, if it doesn't work out exactly how mine is working out, that is okay, as long as you work over those puff stitches exactly the same way each time, your numbers should come out even, because the whole dress is a 6-stitch repeat, and this pattern, this repeat we're doing right now, is a 6-stitch repeat, so it will come out even as long as you treat every single puff stitch exactly the same. So once you've made it all the way around, you'll end with a chain 3, and then you will slip stitch to the first single crochet. You can see I have this repeat all the way around. And then again, just so you can see what I'm doing a little bit easier, I'm going to change colors again into this nice purple. And we're going to chain 1, skip the first stitch, and we're actually going to work a single crochet into the white stitch below our chain 1 space. So our chain 1 space is here, and we're going to work right into this white stitch here. So just working a single crochet, and then working into that big chain 3 space, we are going to work 7 double crochet. So we're creating like a 7 double crochet shell. And then after your shell, you're going to be repeating exactly what we just did. So then we're going to work a single crochet into the stitch under our chain 1 space, and then another 7 double crochet shell in the next chain 3 space, and just repeat this all the way around your row. And once you've made it all the way around, just finish up your last shell. we are going to slip stitch to the first single crochet, and that completes that row. And then for row 3 I will change colors once again, just so you can see what I'm doing a little bit clearer. And we are going to start with a chain 2. And basically this is going to be a repeat of the first trim row, but it's going to look just a little bit different. We're going to start by skipping 2 stitches and single crocheting to that third stitch. Then we will chain 1, skip a stitch, and single crochet to the following stitch. Now we will chain 3, and we are going to skip 5 stitches and single crochet to the next stitch. And just keep repeating this all the way around. So we're going to chain 1, skip a stitch, single crochet to the next stitch, and then we're going to chain 3 and skip 5 stitches. And then begin our repeat again with single crocheting into the next stitch after we skip 5, and just complete this all the way around. When you reach the end of this row, you're going to end with a chain 3, and then you will slip stitch to the first single crochet. So that is what that row looks like. And then for row 4, I'm just going to switch right back to that purple, kind of maroon thread. And row 4 is really just a repeat of row 2. We are going to chain 1, and then we are going to single crochet into the stitch underneath your chain 1 space. So that's back down into the purple stitches. And then we're going to work 7 double crochet into our chain 3 space. And we're just going to keep repeating that all the way around, just like we did in row 2. And once you reach the end of this row, making your last shell, you are just going to slip stitch to the first single crochet. And then you can fasten off and weave in all your ends. And we are almost complete with this dress. So to add the last few touches to this dress, you are going to need to sew on a button or 2, and you can sew it right at the edge here, or you can sew it further over to make this a little bit smaller if you're finding it's a slightly big. But you're just going to place a button wherever you need it to be able to finish up the edge of this dress. And then we are going to crochet on a few straps for this dress as well. So normally for the straps of this dress you would like to use the same color as the top of the dress, but in order to make this look a little easier to see what I am doing, I am going to show you using the purple thread. So we're going to make a slip knot and put it on our hook, and then starting from the edge of the flap, count 8 stitches over and simply slip stitch to that 8th stitch. And then now chain 23 for the 12-month dress. And then once we reach 23 stitches, you're going to pull the front of the dress up, starting on that farthest most stitch. You are going to slip stitch to the first and the 2nd stitch closest to the corner. And this is also why you'd want to use the same color, because these slip stitches may show just a little bit. So once we've slip stitched to those 2 stitches, we are just going to chain 23 again. And once we have the next 23 chain, you're just going to count over 5 stitches from where we started our first chain, and we will slip stitch to that stitch there. And you can just fasten off and weave in your ends at this moment, and then you can repeat the exact same thing for the other side, and your dress will be done. So here is the dress again that we just completed, and if you like this tutorial, I hope you will subscribe and give it a thumbs up. Make sure to check out the other patterns on my blog. They're all free patterns, and we'll see you next time.